When the United States entered World War I under Woodrow Wilson, it was done under a hope. A hope that America, as an impartial nation free from the biases of the European combatants, could make the world safe for democracy and make World War I the war to end all wars. To these ends, he outlined his liberal international vision for Europe, a Europe of democratic nation-states emerging from old empires. These states, in his vision, would negotiate grievances through international institutions and seek peace through free trade. Surely, after such a horrific conflict, Europe and the United States would heed that vision. And yet, merely 20 years later, Europe plunged itself into an even more devastating and morally destructive global conflict. To ask the question of why Wilson's liberal internationalism failed, one must understand its shortcomings, its successes, its hypocrisy, why it was unpopular, and why it almost nearly worked. Ultimately, Wilson's liberal internationalism and participation at Versailles could have been successful in preventing another global conflict, but failed due to contingent reasons and the inability of democratic governments to effectively address the two crises of the 1930s, the Great Depression and fascism. The First World War was one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, a civilizational catastrophe Europe walked into through a system of its own making. The era of great power imperial rivalry, of interlocking alliances and aggressive militarism set in motion a devastating conflict from which no country could escape. Austria-Hungary wanted to punish Serbia, Germany wanted to solidify itself as the strongest power in Europe, Russia wanted to project its imperial power in the Balkans, France wanted to recover its lost territory of Alsace-Lorraine from Germany, Britain wanted to limit Germany's challenge to its naval supremacy, and the Ottoman Empire wanted to reverse imperial collapse. Standing apart from these imperial powers with centuries-old great power rivalries was the United States of America. The United States was a confident, growing industrial power. While struggling with social tensions between business and labor, white and black, and native-born and immigrant, its democratic institutions, almost a century and a half old, and booming economy gave it a sense of fundamental optimism. Protected by two vast oceans, the U.S. had no territorial demands in Europe, no deep-seated rivalries, and no existential fears of its neighbors. After staying on the sideline for 2.5 years, the U.S. entered the war to protect the principle of freedom of the seas, a principle Germany continuously violated through unrestricted submarine warfare. As U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed, "We have no selfish ends to serve, we desire no conquest, no dominion. We seek no indemnity for ourselves, no material compensation for the sacrifices for which we shall freely make. We are but one of the champions of mankind." The New World, progeny of the Old, would come to settle the scores of a continent that had bled itself dry. Wilson sought to bring his idealistic values of liberal internationalism to ensure peace without victory. In January 1918, he outlined to Congress his 14 points that would treat each participant in World War I fairly and impartially. These included open diplomacy with no secret treaties, free and fair trade, reduction of militaries, self-determination for the people of the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires, and lastly, the creation of a League of Nations. Wilson firmly believed that an international community of nations could keep peace, resolve disputes, and guarantee territorial integrity. In late 1918, with the Allies' 100 Days Offensive and the German Revolution, the deadliest conflict yet in human history came to a close with an armistice in the forest of Compiègne. Months later, leaders of the United States, France, the United Kingdom, and Italy met to dictate the terms of peace in the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. Russia, with its communist government having left the war, was not present. The defeated powers were also excluded from the negotiations. The representatives were only invited to receive the terms after they were decided. In the same place the German Empire was so proudly proclaimed 50 years before, the young German Republic would endure its defining moment of humiliation. Woodrow Wilson made history by being the first American president to visit Europe while in office. With the Republicans having won the midterms just a month before, Wilson's visit was contentious domestically. Furthermore, Wilson did not include any prominent Republican congressmen in his peace delegation. Regardless, when Wilson arrived in Europe, millions celebrated him in the streets of London, Paris, and Rome. This only fed his sense of moral purpose as the only person that could achieve international peace. At Versailles, Wilson's idealism was confronted with the punitive views of the other victorious allies, particularly France. Georges Clemenceau, Prime Minister of France, reportedly said, "Mr. Wilson bores me with his 14 points. Why, God Almighty has only 10. The fact that America entered the war in the last few years, suffering no home front damage and facing relatively few casualties compared to other powers, made the Europeans feel that America should not lecture them on what peace should look like. Some of the most extreme demands, such as breaking up of Germany into several different states, or destruction of its industry, were not fulfilled. However, to gain support for his League of Nations idea, Wilson had to compromise on many of the harsh punishments given to Germany, such as France's demand for reparations and the war guilt clause that placed all of the blame for the war's outbreak on Germany. He believed that the League of Nations could help resolve the remaining grievances about the treaty. Getting domestic support for the League was challenged enough even with international approval. Much has been said about the Treaty of Versailles, and to what extent the treaty was too harsh or too lenient. If one is to determine why Wilson's liberal internationalism failed to prevent a Second World War, one must answer this question. Certainly, many of the combatant nations did not expect a bright new era of peace. Supreme Allied Commander Ferdinand Foch called the Treaty of Versailles an armistice for 20 years, believing it to be too lenient. On the other hand, it was specifically the grievances from Versailles that led to the far right taking power in Germany in 1933. Germany lost substantial territories to France, Denmark, and Poland. Though these areas had a substantial German minority, the Alsatian, Danish, and Polish majorities in these regions had been harshly treated under the German Empire. But the principles of self-determination, or the right of a people to determine their nationhood, these territorial losses were just and fair. While the German minorities of these regions had cultural freedom, they also faced discrimination and were typically barred from government jobs. Losing German majority areas in Danzig and the Sudetenland area of Czechoslovakia were more clear violations of the principle of self-determination. Other German grievances with Versailles included the War Guilt Clause, a heavy reparations bill, strict limitations on the size of its army, a ban on naval and air forces, the demilitarization of its industrial core in the Rhineland, and a prohibition on closer ties with Austria. When Woodrow Wilson returned home to the United States, ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, including American membership in the League of Nations, proved difficult. Ratification required approval by 2/3 of the Senate, which meant Wilson needed the support of dozens of Republicans. He needed to appeal to the same politicians he had neglected at Versailles. Opposition to the treaty was fierce and came from two main Republican groups. The Reservationists, led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, would only support League of Nations membership if Article 10 of the treaty would be revised. Article 10 was a collective security clause that required member states to preserve and protect the independence of member states who'd faced external aggression. The Reservationists feared this would take away the congressional power to declare war and hand it to the president. Wilson insisted that any revision to the treaty would mean the United States was not a true member of the League. On the other hand, a smaller number of irreconciliables, led by Senator William E. Borah of Idaho, unconditionally opposed American participation in the League and believed that, even with Congress's power to declare war protected, membership would still risk entangling the U.S. in foreign conflicts. Determined to outflank his opponents in Congress, Wilson went on a demanding speaking tour to rally the American people to support the League. In September 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, he gave his Pueblo speech, defending the League of Nations as necessary for world peace. Shortly after his speech, however, he suffered a debilitating stroke. Thus, at a critical moment, Wilson vanished from the public arena. While he struggled to recover, his wife Edith essentially ran the White House from behind the scenes. For the rest of his term, Wilson's political skills were much diminished, but all of his stubbornness and self-certainty remained intact. In November 1919, Senator Lodge proposed to ratify the treaty with several reservations. Wilson told the treaty to oppose any treaty with modifications. The Democrats joined with the irreconciliables to defeat ratification with Lodge's reservations by a vote of 55 to 39. The Reservationists and Irreconciliables then combined to defeat the unmodified treaty by a vote of 53 to 38. The Senate was in a stalemate. Despite his ruined health, Wilson continued to believe that he had the public on his side and thought he could push the treaty over the top through Democratic victories at the ballot box. Some Senate Democrats tried to save the treaty by negotiating with Lodge. They succeeded in softening the reservations, and when the treaty came up for a final vote in March 1920, a majority now voted in favor, 49 to 35. But Wilson was still opposed to any compromise, and 20 pro-treaty Democratic senators followed his instructions to vote no. This left the treaty 15 votes short of ratification. It would never receive another vote. The Democrats lost the next election badly. Wilson died in 1924, bitterly disappointed but convinced that history would vindicate him. It was these unfortunate contingent reasons and contrivances that were a major factor in why Wilson's liberal internationalism wouldn't succeed. Wilson was an ambitious, idealistic man, but pride, his stubborn insistence on no reservations to League of Nations membership, and his unlucky and severe stroke ensured that isolationism won out. As a result, America, the strongest global power, excluded itself from the very international institution it had helped create. With Wilson's failure to secure Senate support for the League of Nations, the United States largely receded into isolationism during the 1920s. Because American participation in World War I was in large part to make the world safe for democracy, in the eyes of Wilson, America's choice of non-involvement with international institutions made the same isolationists that rejected League membership claim that World War I was some ultimately unnecessary foreign entanglement. While it is easy to view the Treaty of Versailles as a straight line from which Germany fell into fascism due to a mix of nationalist grievances and unstable parliamentary politics, such a summary ignores the fact that Germany was on the path towards genuine recovery during the 1920s. While the early years of Weimar democracy were plagued by political violence and hyperinflation due to hefty reparations, liberal politicians negotiated real solutions. Under a big tent coalition of pro-democracy parties, German Foreign Minister Gustav Stresemann negotiated the Dawes Plan with the US and the powers of Western Europe. The plan would ensure America would give loans to Germany, which would use those loans to pay reparations in a timely manner, allowing Britain and France to pay off their debts to America. Furthermore, Stresemann accomplished German entry into the League of Nations, accepted Germany's Western territorial losses, and, most importantly, helped create the Kellogg-Briand Pact. This treaty was an international agreement signed by the United States, Japan, and nearly every country in Europe. Each signatory renounced the use of war as a means of national policy and resolving disputes. This brief era of peace and stability in Germany and the rest of the world shows the kind of world Wilson envisioned. The major powers of Europe, most of them liberal democracies at the time, sought negotiation and international cooperation over warfare, with the United States as a diplomatic, involved international power. Despite the rough initial years of the post-war era, it seemed, for a brief period of time, that Wilson's vision of liberal internationalism was indeed working. This then raised the question, why did a Second World War break out? There are two reasons. One was the Great Depression. While Germany had enjoyed several years of recovery, it was under an unstable coalition of parties that only agreed upon democracy and opposing the extremes of the left and right, lacking a shared economic ideology to govern in the face of difficult choices. As the Great Depression spread to Europe, an economic dispute over the funding of unemployment insurance led to the government collapsing. This, in turn, led to a further loss of faith in democracy and, within a few years, the Nazis taking power. If we were to view this crisis in the context of Wilson's ideals and his legacy, one can argue that the pro-business policies of the Republican Party, rejecting the progressive economic values of Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt, passed policies during the 1920s that increased wealth inequality, thus lowering the working class's purchasing power, and did little to regulate the volatile stock market, ultimately contributing to the Great Depression. Liberal democratic nations, if they fail to work on behalf of the people and suffer from a lack of shared civic ideals, can fall into tyranny. Franklin Delano Roosevelt recognized the government's responsibility to help the American people in times of crisis and succeeded where Germany's coalition failed to do so. The second reason why the Second World War broke out was the inability of Western Europe and America to confront fascist ideology for what it was, an uncompromising force of aggression and militarism. Wilson's vision of an international institution to solve disputes, actualized through the League of Nations, was successful in preventing conflicts in some instances. When a dangerous dispute broke out between Finland and Sweden regarding the Swedish-populated Åland Islands, the League of Nations arbitrated a solution that kept the islands under Finnish sovereignty but with self-government and cultural autonomy. The League also enforced the principles of self-determination when partitioning the German territory of Silesia through a vote in which the people voted on being a part of Germany or Poland. These arbitrations worked because governments were willing to subject themselves to international law if it meant peace. When fascism arose, however, the League and Western Europe did not know how to address it. When Italy invaded Ethiopia, one of two independent African countries, the Emperor Haile Selassie arrived in Geneva, the League's headquarters, to seek international support. He warned that it is us today, it shall be you tomorrow. Britain and France did not heed the warning, however. They still hoped to have Italy's help in containing Germany, so the League imposed only minimal sanctions. When Germany remilitarized the Rhineland and reintroduced conscription, with clear violations of the Treaty of Versailles, France and Britain did nothing. World War II could have very well been prevented had France militarily enforced the region's demilitarization. When Japan invaded Manchuria, the League of Nations, lacking any enforcing power of its own, only kicked Japan out of the League. In the years leading up to World War II, Europe was so scared of war and America was so isolationist that they were paralyzed to do any military action in the face of a fundamentally aggressive ideology. It was only after each of Germany's promises had been violated and Hitler set his sights on Poland that Britain and France finally mounted a response. By then, it would take the deadliest conflict in human history, immense human suffering, and the division of Europe between free and subjugated to finally put down fascism. This conflict, World War II, though horrific and even more destructive than the war that came before, strengthened democracy and succeeded where Wilson failed to do so. The conflict bound American interests to Europe, and the country would not retreat into isolationism once more. Germany, with a country not only defeated but ravaged, had its institutions rebuilt from the ground up, with its centuries-old tradition of militarism uprooted. Europe and America not only wanted but needed West Germany to be built in their image as a sensible democracy. The United States spent billions of dollars to rebuild Western Europe under the Marshall Plan, both to stabilize democracy and ward off the influence of communism, as well as to have a market to sell their consumer goods to. Collective security was codified and enforced by NATO, recognizing the military threat that the Soviet Union now posed. The struggle for human rights and victory over the ideologies of racial supremacy also made the principles of liberty fully and more impartially applied. Wilson, it must be acknowledged, was a deeply prejudiced white supremacist who enforced federal segregation and ignored the pleas of colonized people for their self-determination. If Britain and France fought for a world in which all men were created equal, then they needed to adhere to those principles and give self-determination to the peoples of Africa and Asia. In America, too, the fight against racial supremacy abroad contradicted deeply embedded white supremacy at home. This strengthened the civil rights movement, and not long after World War II, President Truman would desegregate the military. Lastly, the United Nations was created to replace the League of Nations. Though suffering from similar issues as its predecessor, such as lacking significant power and needing significant cooperation, the UN has indeed been a force for good in the world. The UN Security Council has, at times, created international coalitions to defend nations in the Korean and Gulf War, has created the Universal Declaration of Human Rights through which all people are entitled to dignity and principle, and has made efforts at peacekeeping in unstable regions around the world. The noble but ambitious work to establish international laws and global standards of human rights neither began nor ended at the Palace of Versailles. While Wilson's vision of the post-war world was not fulfilled, its legacy is immense. When liberal democracy faced its greatest challenge in the 1930s and 1940s, it learned from and built off of Wilson's principles. If one is to view world history as a dialectical series of events that leads to historical progress, then perhaps one can argue the 1930s and World War II was a brutal but necessary struggle to resolve the contradictions of democracy and Wilson's shortcomings. If fascism was the result of the inability of many democratic governments to help an alienated middle and working class in times of crisis, then it was the social progressives like FDR and organizations like the British Labour Party that helped to create social security, the welfare state, and modern labor protections, showing that democracies can indeed help the people. With fascism as the antithesis to Western powers, it showed the weakness of democracy during the Depression when millions voted for the Nazi Party, and during its early expansion, in which a war-weary republic sought appeasement over confrontation. It was through this expansion that Britain and the United States recognized the need for collective security in confronting aggression when diplomacy is an sensible alternative. Woodrow Wilson and his principles were complicated, ambitious, hypocritical, and profound. His legacy is equal parts an inspiration and a failure. Those international values, written to prevent a second Great War, may not have been successful. His ideals have been built off of, improved, and transformed into the very foundation of the modern liberal international order.